Hi, and welcome back to the channel. So, what are we going to look at today? Well, it's a Macintosh LC475. So this machine wasn't one that I encountered back in the day because around 1992, I left college where I'd been using Macs and I went to work for a company that made PCs. So from then on, for the next few years, I was basically working with PCs all the time. This is the follow-up to a machine that I did use, the Quadra 700, and that may sound weird. I mean, it hasn't got Quadra in its name, has it? Well, that's because the internals of this machine actually appear in 3 different models that Apple made at the time. There was the Performer, there was the LC, and then there was the Quadra. Now, the Performer and the LC had exactly the same case. They just had different branding, different model numbers on them, but they're basically exactly the same machine. The Quadra, the same. Internally, it's the same machine, but it does have a different case. Now, the LC was aimed at education. The Performer was aimed at the consumer, so that would have been sold in department stores and at Apple resellers, I would have supposed. And then the Quadra was aimed at the professional market, so would have appeared in suitable publications and also, of course, at resellers. So yeah, let's have a little bit of a deep dive into this machine and its brethren and see what we can see. So the original Quadra, the Quadra 700, was released in 1991, and it was a very expensive machine for that time. The only machine which was more expensive was the Quadra 950, which was a tower machine aimed more at the server market. In 1993, the Quadra 700 was replaced by the Quadra 800, but again, it was a very expensive machine. Now, the Quadra in the Quadra name stands for the 68040. Apple, at this point, to remain competitive, had to release more machines using the 68040 because they were competing with the 486 chips from Intel. However, they obviously needed to get the price down. So they needed to do some marketing shenanigans to try and make the Quadra appear to be all things to all men. For this reason, they seem to have gone for a 3 naming policy. They kept the Quadra name for the higher end machines, they used the Performer name for the consumer market, and the LC name, indicating lower cost, was marketed to educational establishments. So in late 1993, the Quadra 605 was released, and it's aimed very specifically at the lower cost bracket. To achieve that price, it had to make some compromises. The 68040, which is supplied with the machine, is not the full version, it's the LC version. That means that it's missing the floating point unit, and that means it's not so good at working with floating point mathematics. If you're in a typical office environment, the removal of the FP unit wouldn't have been such a big compromise, and I think it was a good move by Apple to save on costs. The machine comes with 4 MB of RAM, which is upgradable to 36, and it has an 80 MB hard drive as the base option. Another compromise was that the machine only supported out of the box 256 colours. This wasn't so bad for the time, in fact it was very standard. On the PC platform, that would have been a high-end PC. But you could upgrade the RAM to 1 MB and then you could actually use 16-bit colour, which would allow you to do basic Photoshop editing, although it would have been preferable to have 24-bit colour. At the same time, the Quadra 610 was released. As you can see, it's a larger desktop unit, and it also features an optical drive, which again was a compromise which was removed from the 605. You can see also that it has a full 68040, although running at the same speed as the 605. And apart from this, it has twice the amount of memory and a larger hard drive and so on and so forth. But for those extra features, you're obviously going to have to pay more. In this case, it's $500, which would have been a considerable amount of money back in the 1990s. So you can see looking at the Quadra 605 that it has echoes of the design language that started to be evolved in the Quadra 800. You can see it has those rounded feet. These do not feature on the Performer or LC models. And you can also see that it has a rounded front, which is something which you actually see on those 2 models as well. And also on the side, you can see those 3 stripes. Well, they're actually ventilation ducts. You can see looking at the 475 that it's very similar to Quadra 605. You can see it still has the same curved front to the case, but now it has stripes on the top. The rounded feet are gone, And now you have these semicircular bars that raise the machine up at the front, whereas the Quadra sat flat to the desk. On the side, we still have the stripes, although they are implemented slightly differently. But don't forget, internally, these machines are basically identical depending on the spec that you get. So the Quadra 605 was simply an attempt by Apple's marketing department to differentiate between the low-cost 475 and the higher-end brand of the Quadra. In reality, of course, internally, they're the same machine. If we take a look at the rear of the machine, you can see that the low-cost goals are in play here. At this point in time, you could turn on the Mac normally by pressing a button on the keyboard. But the LC is missing this circuitry, so you always have to turn it on via the switch that you can see there on the back. Next to the switch, you've got the power input, and to the right of it, you've got the monitor jack. To the right of this, you have the printer port and the modem port, and then you have the external 25-pin SCSI port. You have a single ADB port, a 3.5mm headphone port, and a 3.5mm microphone port. And to the right of this, you can see there's a removable port, which allows you to access any devices which have been installed in the internal PDS slot. Of all the machines of its era, the LC475 has to be one of the easiest machines to get into from its time. It's really, really simple. So let me show you how you do that. So I need to move the monitor out of the way. This is actually the monitor that came with the machine. I bought this from somebody who appeared to be a teacher. They were living in a gatehouse of what looked to be a private school nearby where I live in a village called Godalming, a good old Anglo-Saxon name there. And when I received it, it was in excellent condition, as you can see here. The monitor does actually work, but there are graphical issues with this machine, and we'll have a look at that later. So let me move the monitor out of the way. So to open up the machine, you need to go around the back, obviously, and there is a single screw there. Now you can see that on this machine, the screw has gone missing, and the reason for that is, and it's very common, these machines were very easy to access, and owners would very often do that and then not bother to put the screw back in, and the screw is then lost to time. You can see there are two tabs. You have to be careful with these because obviously this is very old plastic, and you're relying on the flexibility of this plastic to open these tabs. So you just pop these open like this. As I said, very gently. And then you just move the case a little bit forward and up. So there we go. That's how easy it is to get into this case. So now that we've got the top off, why don't we have a look inside? So let me give you a little bit of a tour of this machine. Bear in mind, I have made some modifications. This is not a stock LC475, but it's nothing radical. And I'll show you what those are as we go through it. So at the front here on the right-hand side, we have the original floppy drive, still working great. I think it's a 1.44 megabyte drive, and something which was becoming slightly outmoded at the time. You were starting to get CD-ROMs as being the way to supply software. You still would have needed a floppy disk drive to actually get software installed quite often. So yeah, still a pretty vital piece of kit in this machine. At the back of the machine here, you've got the power supply made by Aztec. And I've been told that these can be problematic, that the capacitors can leak. I've checked mine and it doesn't seem to have any problems at this point, but obviously something I need to be aware of for the future. And yeah, the voltages are fine. So for now it's okay, but I probably should buy some capacitors and actually recap this power supply at some point. And I will do that. Behind it there, you've got two sticks of VRAM. Now these are 256K sticks. And you can actually put 5 12K sticks in this machine. This is the base configuration, obviously very common. And with this, you can do, I think it's 832 by something or other as the highest resolution, but you are going to be limited to 256 colors in all resolutions. So if you wanted to do, let's say, desktop publishing, Photoshop work, you almost certainly would have wanted to upgrade these sticks, or possibly bought a higher end machine, one of the Quadras. Yeah, this was a good machine really for the price, you know, if you wanted to do productivity work like that in terms of graphics. Behind these sticks, you've got 8 chips soldered onto the board, and that's actually the main system RAM. It gives you 4 megabytes of system RAM, which is actually not bad for the time, pretty bog standard to be honest. If you think about 1992, 93, 94, something like that, 4 megabytes of RAM would have been pretty normal But obviously, if you were going to do, as I said, Photoshop work, you would have wanted to put more memory on the machine. And you can do that because behind it, you've got a single SIM slot, which allows you to put expansion RAM. Now, in my case, I've actually added a 16 megabyte SIM, very cheap to buy these days. And so this machine actually has 20 megabytes of RAM, which for 1993 would have been really good. So quite a large amount of RAM. Our college Quadra had, I believe, 32 meg, which is, it's important when you're dealing with 24-bit color images. So yeah, that would have been something that would have been, I guess, maybe a common upgrade for these machines. Something to bear in mind is that the SIMs at the time would have been very expensive, 32 megabyte SIMs. So yeah, maybe more commonly people would have put an extra 8 in, 16 maybe, rarely 32. But over time, you got larger SIMs. And although the official maximum RAM for this machine is, I believe, 36 megabytes, which is 4 megabytes plus 32, one 32 megabyte stick, you can actually put 128 megabyte sticks in. And apparently that works. So that would then give you 132 megabytes, which for those days would have been an insane amount of RAM. But it's interesting that that actually is possible. So let's move on. Then behind it, you've got the 68040. So let me just show you, let's just tilt the camera so you can actually see this. Hopefully you can see the name there on the chip. This would have been a 68040 LC, which meant it didn't have an FPU unit in it. So yeah, let's have a quick look at the original chip and what I've replaced it with here. So luckily I happen to have a couple of these processors spare. And on the left there is the original processor, I think, that was in this machine. But if you look there at the name, you can see it says 68 and in the center there, LC. That indicates that it's the lower cost 68040. It does have a cheaper one than this that doesn't actually have memory management unit as well. And that has an E designation, which again would be even cheaper, as I said. But yeah, not something you'd really want to have in your Macintosh at the time. And then over here, we've actually got an example of the processor that I've actually swapped in to give the machine faster FPU performance. This is the full 68040, and you can see on the far right of the chip there, it says 25. Well, that shows that it's a 25 megahertz chip. You can, I believe, put a 33 megahertz chip in if you can get one of those. I do have, I believe, a 40. And if I were to put that in, then I could potentially overclock the CPU up to 33 megahertz. And that actually would be worth doing because that would give you much more performance than you might think you might get from it. 8 megahertz is approximately 1/3 of 25. So that would be a 25% speed increase, which is, nothing to really sniff at. So yeah, this machine actually has a floating point unit, which makes it considerably faster when obviously doing floating point maths. Who would have needed that? Scientists. I would assume that maybe some of the math in Photoshop would require it. Also, if you did any kind of 3D rendering, then it would have been massively faster if you actually had an FPU unit in the chip. It was a reasonable compromise by Apple to remove the FPU and install an LC68040. But yeah, if you wanted to do more serious work, you needed to put the full 68040 in. Here you actually have a fan, a low profile fan. What is it? Something like 7 centimeters, 6 centimeters, something like that. Something that I think I will actually upgrade. This machine does have a bit of a high pitch whine, and I think it's coming from the fan. I'd obviously have to be careful to get a low profile fan of that size, some kind of Noctua. I'm assuming that they do one of that size. Not really sure, to be honest. Maybe it's a more difficult size to find these days. Because you have a 68040, it does generate quite a lot of heat. So that is something you definitely need in this machine, the fan. Then behind it, going on to the left-hand side of the machine, we've got the PRAM battery. PRAM is where parameters are stored on a Mac of this era. Parameters would be things like, let's say you had 32-bit addressing turned on in the OS or turned off, whatever. That would need to be stored so that every time you booted up the machine, it actually was kept. And the battery also was used to keep the clock working as well. Because you obviously, when you reboot the machine, you don't want to have to set the clock every single time. Now, in most machines, the PRAM battery isn't needed. You can actually boot up the machine and use it and just take on the fact that the clock isn't going to work correctly each time. But in this machine, no. If you don't have the PRAM battery in, it won't boot. At least you won't have any graphics anyway, and that's pretty much the same thing. You won't be able to do anything. So yeah, that's something that caught me when I got this machine out of storage for this video. And we'll have a look at that later. Got to remember to put that battery back in when we actually turn the machine on. Then to the left of it, or towards the front of the case, we've got the SCSI connector and the SCSI cable going over here to a SCSI to SD card, which is a modern piece of equipment used to emulate SCSI hard disks. At this point, this is actually a little bit legacy. We're in 2025 at this point. I believe I bought this about 3 years ago. Not really sure you can get these anymore. These days, it's more normal to buy the successor to these cards, which would be a Zulu SCSI or a Blue SCSI. They're faster, more flexible. They have more features. This particular card uses a microSD, and that gives you basically 4 SCSI devices. I've got, I think, SCSI, is it 0, 1, 2, 3, or maybe 1, 2, 3, 4. And each one of those is 2 gigabytes. The hard drive maximum is 2 gigabytes, actually. So what I've done is I've got, as I said, 4 drives, each with 2 gigabytes on, which is a massive amount of storage for the day. This drive originally would have been, I think the high-end version was 250 megabytes, something like that. I think the low-end drive was 80 megabytes. So yeah, you know, having 4 drives in this machine with 2 gigabytes on each is, yeah, it's massive, massive really for the time. And the last thing we'll look at over here is the processor direct slot. This is actually the only expansion in this machine. And I believe there were cards to give you Ethernet. You may have also been able to get a graphics card, which would allow you to have 2 monitors, something like that. We're actually going to use this slot, and it's actually pivotal to the use of this machine in a future video, where I look at a very special and rare card that you can get specifically for this machine. I was very, very lucky to actually buy this machine because a couple of years later, I found out about this card, and it only works in a few machines, and this is one of them. So we're going to be looking at that in the next video, and I'll actually link to that video in this one once that video is actually produced, so you can go and watch that video afterwards if you're interested. Very cool video, hopefully. That will be interesting to you because hopefully, you know, you're a bit of a Mac nut like I am. So yeah, that's the inside of the machine. Really nice design, very compact. And, you know, this is a good machine for a person that's new to retro Macs. Quite a simple machine. The expansion of it isn't too difficult to do. You know, there's not that much you can really expand in it. And it's a very light machine, easy to carry around. So definitely one to get really as a starter machine for retro Mac fans. Now at this point, it makes sense to actually show you benchmarks of the machine. But when I got the machine out of storage, I didn't actually have those on the machine. So I needed to get data on the machine. There's a section in the channel members version of this video where I actually outline exactly how I got those benchmarks onto the machine. If you're interested in that, please join the channel and help this channel to grow with better quality equipment, such as a 3D printer and so on. Anyway, hope to see you in there, but otherwise, let's crack on with the video. So we've had a look inside the machine. Let's now turn it on and see how it performs with the upgrades that I've added to it. I've already, as you can see, put it back together, obviously, and I made a point of putting the PRAM battery back in. Very important because otherwise it won't boot. You'll end up with a black screen and obviously you can't do anything. And the other issue is as well, if you leave your PRAM battery out, it won't remember any settings. And that's a big issue because the mouse speed and other settings, like if it's going to use 32-bit memory, so on and so forth, they get lost every time you boot. So it's a bit of a pain, to be honest. So let's turn the machine on. And I'm going to apologize for the rolling image. I'm going to try and stabilize it as best I can in post, but unfortunately I don't have any method right now for actually rectifying it. So I'm going to use stills as much as I can to stop it rolling. And then when I have to change the picture, I'm afraid you're just going to have to put up with the rolling image. So let's just let it boot up. So obviously everything right now is booting off the SCSI to SD card that I showed you earlier. And that gives me more drives, and each of those drives is 2 gigabytes. So this machine is definitely not short of storage space. Okay, so we booted up and I'm going to go straight into the benchmarks. So let's open up this one here. Not sure how you actually change the base benchmark on this. It seems to insist on loading up the Quadra 630 as one of the machines to compare with. But I'm going to load up the Quadra 950 and I'm going to load up the Quadra 700 as well. This is just to give you an idea of the performance of this machine versus those machines. So there we are. There's some of the Quadras, a smattering of them. And now let's open up the LC475, which should be relatively close to those in performance. And I'm also going to load up the benchmarks for this particular machine, because don't forget, we've actually got a full 6840 in it, not the cut-down version. There we are. There's the benchmark I've saved. So if you look at the CPU, let's look at the Quadra 950. Now, this was a very high-end machine, so maybe it's not a fair comparison. But if I right-click on here, you can see it says a 68040 with a 33 megahertz processor. That means that the processor is about, what is it, 24% faster than a Quadra 700. And that's just basically the clock speed of the CPU. That gives you that extra speed. If you look at the LC475, it's actually a little bit faster than that. It's 29% faster. I'm not quite sure why that is the case. But interestingly, if you look down and you can see that pink bar for the LC475 full, you can see it's actually 79. So for some reason, it's a little bit faster, even though the only difference is actually just the FPU. But maybe there's something else about the chip that gives it that little extra boost in performance. A little bit strange, but I wasn't quite expecting that. The big win is if we go down and look at floating point performance. You can see the 950 is seen as being 102, so it's a little bit faster than the 630, which is our base machine. But then you've got the Quadra 700, which is only 22%. It's 22% slower than the 950. And then the stinker, which is the LC475, which is only 8% of the speed of the Quadra 630 950. They're both pretty similar to each other, really. So it's painfully slow compared to those machines. But you can see that when we look at the LC475 with a full 68040, it's up to 76%, which is, basically in the same ballpark as the Quadra 700. The only difference then between this machine and those other machines is the fact that this is running at 25 megahertz, not 33 megahertz. So there is the possibility with this machine of upgrading it with a 68040, which is running at 40 megahertz. And then I can make some small mods to the machine. There's a resistor that needs to be moved from one place on the logic board to another. And then there's a software patch that you have to run. And then this machine can actually run, I believe, at 40 megahertz, definitely a 33. If I can get it running at 40 megahertz, that would be amazing, because that would be close to twice as fast in terms of integer maths and general performance. And on top of that, the FPU in that machine will also run that fast as well, which would make it a very, very powerful machine for this little case here. Now, I mentioned earlier there are graphical glitches. I don't know if you can see it. It's actually quite small on the camera, but the icon here for this application has little artifacts in it, little dots. You can see some little dots on the Apple icon here, and I'm not quite sure how this is meant to appear, but I believe these are glitches as well. When I got this machine, I didn't really realize there was an issue with it, but now I've actually looked at it on an LCD monitor where the graphics are a little bit clearer. You can see that there are little glitches. When I was doing some research about this machine, I read about the fact that Apple found that it was very sensitive to which SIMs you put in it for the VRAM. And if the SIMs are not basically perfect for whatever the technical reason is for this machine, you will get little pixel glitches in different places. Why, though, does this machine have it? Because it's only got the original amount of VRAM. Well, I was thinking, there's a possibility that the VRAM itself wasn't quite right, even though it came from Apple, or potentially that VRAM had a fault and it was replaced with new VRAM, and that VRAM doesn't quite match. So in the future, I could fix that issue by upgrading the RAM, but unfortunately it costs, I think, about £60, £80. The only other benefit of doing that is it would give me 16-bit color, but I don't really intend to do any productivity work on this machine, so I'm not really sure if that's necessary. So there we go, the LC475, a really interesting budget machine from Apple from the early 90s. And I find it fascinating in part because of the marketing choices that they made. You know, they had kind of decided that the Quadra brand was going to be something which was high-end, but at the same time, because the 68040 was really the sort of last performant processor that Motorola did in the 68,000 range, they'd started to really paint themselves into a corner. In the previous years, you had machines which were based on 68020, 68030s, and then of course the 68040, but now there was nowhere else to go really. So how do you differentiate between a professional machine, in quotes, a Quadra, and then you've got a low-cost machine, which is also actually a Quadra? Well, you do that by actually calling it not a Quadra. You give it the low-cost branding, whereas in fact, in reality, it's actually the same machine as the Quadra 605, which was meant to be the sort of top of the line machine that they made. So yeah, it's interesting the marketing that they did on this machine. It's actually a good machine. It's very performant. The OS runs really well on it. It's relatively snappy. And I think it's a great machine, and I definitely recommend anybody out there who can get their hands on a Performer, an LC, or a Quadra 605, then it's definitely worth snapping up and having some fun with, especially if you can get one of these really great monitors with it as well. Very lucky myself to find this coming on the market with the keyboard, the mouse, the unit, the monitor, and it even had the manuals with it, if you can believe that, in good condition as well. So yeah, whoever had this machine really looked after it over the last 20, 30 years. So why was I interested in getting this machine out of storage? Because I don't have room in my cabin, this space here, to put every machine out all the time. Well, there is a specific reason why I really wanted to get this machine out. I am also interested in Apple IIs, and I've done a series of videos on those, and people seem to be pretty happy with them. I'll put some links up here so you can watch them if you're interested in them. It's a 3-part series going all the way back to the beginnings of the Apple II, with the Apple I, obviously, and then the Apple II and Apple II Plus E, etc., etc. When I was researching that story, I came across a really interesting sort of tail end of the Apple story, which is that the Apple IIe was kind of technically still on sale in 1995, which is kind of crazy when you think it was a machine that was launched in 1977. And the reason for that was that Apple actually produced a card which could be put into a machine and then turn that machine into an Apple IIe. Why would they do that? Why would they want you to have an Apple IIe in a Macintosh? Well, the reason is that many educational establishments had a lot of Apple IIe software, and they didn't want to get rid of those machines. They still wanted to use them. So Apple came up with this cunning plan to wean people onto Macintoshes by putting an Apple IIe inside them. It's a really cunning plan, I've got to say. I'm not sure if it worked, but yeah, it's interesting. Now, there was a very kind gentleman who watched those videos. His name is Brian Roy. And he reached out to me and he said, I actually have one of those cards, because I said that I would be very interested in getting one and trying it out. It's a bit of a grail card, actually, quite expensive these days. And yeah, Brian was kind enough to actually donate one to the channel. So thank you, Brian. You're very, very kind. I can't believe that you actually did that. We are not worthy, as it were. So thank you very much for that. This is actually that card. It is an Apple IIe on a logic board. This is actually something which I believe was partially done so that the Apple IIe could actually be put onto an Apple IIgs. And obviously the work for that then made this card possible, where they could actually put an Apple IIe into a host Macintosh machine. It actually comes with a rather interesting cable as well. It's got a symbol on here for a disk drive, and it has a symbol on this end of the cable here for a joystick. It actually plugs into the back of this card. And you remember earlier I said that this can then come out the back of the machine? Well, that's where that PDS port that you can take out comes into play, and this will actually poke out of that port and allow you to plug in this cable. So that, I think, is going to be a really interesting video coming up hopefully pretty soon. I'm actually going to release it as part of my MARCHintosh series, which I'll start it in March. It's now March the 28th today. I'm not sure I will finish it in March, but I will still release it as a MARCHintosh video, because it is actually about the Apple Mac and of course the Apple IIe as well. So yeah, I think that's going to be a really fascinating thing to have a look at in my next video. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video and the lovely LC475. And if you haven't been here before, please click on the like button to show that you like the video. That will then get it out to other people who are interested in the same kind of subjects as you are. And obviously, if you haven't been here before and you would like to see more on this, especially if you want to see the video on the Apple IIe card, then please subscribe. Hit the subscribe button and make sure you hit the bell button as well, because that will make sure you get notified when that video comes out so you don't miss it. Yeah, a fun machine, I think. And I think it's going to be even more fun playing around with putting this Apple IIe card into the LC475 in the next video. I hope to catch you in that one, but until then, take care.